hold elimination. Okay? No, Jack Levin is not a relative, even though we have the same name. I've been asked all kinds of questions. But we feel like we're related. Even though, actually I should tell you that Jack, my brother-in-law Bobby, and myself went to AIC together. So we quickly got to know each other as you get lumped by the alphabet. I think that's how it happened, Jack, right? And we became fast friends. And even though we've talked on the phone many times since we went to AIC, and I've seen Jack via the media on TV, we really have not seen each other. And that's why it took me a few minutes to get started today, because we just had to reminisce and catch up on family. In fact, I had to introduce him to my son Michael, who is 25, because he has a son Michael who is 25. So now we have two Michael Levins that we've got to get together somehow. So much for the personal part of it. As most of you read, Jack is a sociology professor at Northeastern University. He's written 12 textbooks and monographs, including The Functions of Discrimination and Prejudice, Ageism, Prejudice and Discrimination Against the Elderly, and Mass Murder, America's Growing Menace. He has had more than 50 articles published in journals and another 50 articles published in popular magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, and USA Today. And he has appeared, as I told you, I'd seen him many times, on radio and TV for more than 800 interviews on Good Morning America, Donahue, Geraldo, Oprah, Sally Jesse Raphael, and Larry King Live, to name a few. Right now, Jack is in the process, has works in the process on hate crimes, prejudice, and violence in America, the Gainesville campus murders, elementary statistics and behavioral research, and overkill. And I'm truly pleased and proud to present to you this afternoon Jack Levin.
Please let me know if I speak too loudly, because I do have a loud voice. You can just ask my students. Actually, you can literally ask them, because a couple of former students are here now, and they no longer. I teach at Northeastern, and they no longer are at Northeast. They've transferred, I think, to U of Mass. Is that right, U of Mass Amherst? And I hope that I didn't have a lot to do with that decision. I'd like to think I affect people, but not like that. But yeah, money, that has something. And also, you know, my mother is here, and many friends, and I even have my former professor.
Your subject.
Excuse me?
Your subject.
What do I teach? I teach a course called The Sociology of Prejudice and Violence, which I'm going to tell you about soon, I promise. I also teach a course in criminal homicide and other things that you probably don't want me to talk about, like statistics. But as I was saying, I have a Professor Bob Bulkey, who's here, and he was my professor at AIC, and it's a real surprise that he came. And I, as soon as I saw him, I said, "Please don't ask me hard questions. It's not fair. Not again." No, he's a terrific professor, and I owe him a lot. And it's really like home week, because this is really the place that I think of when I think of home, even though I moved here from Houston, Texas, and was here only a few months when I graduated from classical, and then went to AIC for 4 years. And I remember the first time that this was in February, we were living, I think, in a hotel at that point, just when we had moved, and I walked outside. I had lived, my entire life in New Orleans and Houston, Texas, and I walked outside, and it had been snowing, and it was a little drab and dreary, and I saw a lot of people with coats on, and I looked at people, and I said, I'll never forget this. I said, "Gosh, everybody here looks Jewish." And I was, you may wonder, what did I mean by that? That's a good question. Well, the thing is, when I lived in Houston, I only saw a tiny slice of humanity. You know, most of the people I saw were white, Baptists and Methodists, Anglo-Saxon origin. Here, I saw the whole range of humanity. What I didn't realize was I was seeing Italians and Greeks and people of Turkish descent and Arabs, and I was seeing people of just the whole range, which I just never saw before. And so I didn't really feel like the Lone Ranger. Do you know what I mean? Or Tonto, I suppose. Well, I really wanted to talk to you today about Geraldo Rivera's new book. Have you heard of it, Exposing Myself? I'll tell you why. I figured it would hold your attention for a half hour. And then I asked myself, but what does Geraldo's autobiography have to do with anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance? Well, the answer turns out to be plenty. And I'm not referring to the fact that Geraldo is a Puerto Rican Jew. That's not what I mean. You know, until recently, what was regarded as scandalous gossip could easily destroy the career of a national celebrity, and it didn't take very much. Not by present-day standards. For example, Ingrid Bergman couldn't find work in Hollywood for 16 years after she left her husband and child for Roberto Rossellini. And radio stations refused in the 50s to play the records of Jerry Lee Lewis when he married his teenage third cousin. And I'm sure you remember Eddie Fisher, whose divorce from Debbie Reynolds caused really an end to his career as a matinee idol. Well, times have really changed, haven't they? And today's celebrities, sure, they still complain about all the bad publicity that they get in supermarket tabloids and kiss and tell biographies, but they're far less vulnerable than their predecessors. There's no question about that. And as a matter of fact, in an ironic twist, some celebrities are now spreading dirt about themselves. And that's what Geraldo did in his autobiography. He confesses having affairs with Bette Midler, Margaret Trudeau, Liza Minnelli, among others. He reveals having experimented with drugs, and he admits to being an addict. That's what he calls himself when it comes to womanizing. But you know, Rivera's book probably tells us more about ourselves as a people than about Geraldo. I think it reminds us that in this day and age, almost anything goes. Divorce, infidelity, promiscuity are all at an unheard of, an unprecedented, all-time high. In fact, in Los Angeles, where everything is at an unprecedented level, the divorce rate is 1 out of 1. For every marriage, there is a divorce. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody gets divorced, because, you know, Elizabeth Taylor got divorced 8 times, so that leaves room on the other side for 8 people to stay married, and the divorce rate is still 1 out of 1. And the crime rate soars out of sight. And by the way, I predict that it will continue to soar out of sight for the next few years, just based on demographics alone. But that's not the only thing that's wrong. Well, what in 1954, 1962 would have been considered deviant or maybe even evil is now regarded as ordinary or normal. In fact, a detailing of the most unsavory elements in the life of a celebrity only serves to make him into a flesh and blood mortal, a victim of circumstances with whom the average person can more easily identify. He becomes one of the boys or one of the girls. Yes, anything goes as long as it keeps a celebrity in the spotlight. And it seems to me that the very same anything goes ethic, or maybe lack of ethic, can be found in what I see as a growing culture of hate, a growing culture of bigotry in American society. And you can see it at the risk of appearing like a Neanderthal to young people. You can see it in popular music, humor, motion pictures, and politics. Seems to me that hatred has once again become hip. Intolerance is in. And what in 1969 or 1974 might have been whispered behind closed doors is today blatantly shouted in public without fear of retaliation, without fear of reprimand. And I mean, just to check this out, before I tell you in detail about this, I checked this out with my college students who are somewhat younger than I am, and for the most part. And, you know, they agree with me. They agree with me. They see it too. Let me just give you some of the examples. Our young people today are listening to rap music. Not all rap music is like this, only about 20%, but that's enough, by NWA or Public Enemy or Ice-T. And the lyrics, in case you haven't heard them, extol the virtues of violence against women, against gays, against the police, against Jews. And on the whiter side of the ledger, heavy metal lyrics. Again, maybe only 20%. Often tunes that make the top 40 by groups like Guns N' Roses or Motley Crue. They push such values as Satanism, sexism, and violence. And popular stand-up comics are no better. I call them attack comics, a new genre, like Andrew Dice Clay and the late Sam Kinison, just to take two. They belittle and disparage vulnerable people, including women and immigrants and senior citizens. And on the radio, so do the people I call shock jocks, like Rush Limbaugh and Howard Stern. And in R-rated slasher films across the country, these are films these are not pornographic or obscene. They're readily available to any 11-year-old boy who has a VCR and a television set. These R-rated slasher films depict women as brutally victimized. I mean, in ways that I hope you never see. They are so despicable. For example, in a little film called I Spit on Your Grave, there's a 25-minute gang rape scene. And this film is not considered pornographic, so it is readily available. And I think that's the point. And on college campuses around the country, it has become fashionable to tell Jap jokes. Now, not about the Japanese, although that's a surprise because we don't like them either, right? But Jewish American princess jokes. And some of them, I admit, are apparently benign. I mean, for example, what does a Jap make for dinner? Reservations. Now that's funny. By the way, I just want to make one other point before I forget. Just because it's funny doesn't mean it isn't dangerous. I mean, I used to smoke. I was smoking like a few packs a day when I was finishing my dissertation. I guess I was very nervous. Who wouldn't be? But, you know, if you had asked me, hey, how do you like smoking? I would have said, it's great. I mean, I do it all the time. It was probably killing me, but so what? I mean, I was enjoying it. And you ask children what television programs they like, and they'll tell you the most violent ones on television. Does that mean it's good for them? I mean, just because it's funny doesn't mean it isn't dangerous. And so these Jap jokes are more dangerous than you might think. But let me give you the ones that aren't so subtle that they're telling on some college campuses. These suggest that the world would be better off if all Jewish women were exterminated. For example, joke. A solution to the Jap problem. When they go to get nose jobs, tie their tubes as well. Or here's one that's even worse. This is really disgusting. Are you ready for this one? What do you call 49 Japs lying face down in deep water? Answer, a good start. Now, these Jap jokes are really new versions of old themes. And the theme that strikes me as most dangerous is that Jews have too much wealth and power for their own good. It's the same theme that was used for thousands of years to justify killing Jews. So let's not think that these are as benign or as cute as they may first appear. Certainly this same culture of hate has invaded even the most respectable commentators. You know David Duke. He got 55% of the white vote when he ran for governor of Louisiana. It's true he didn't get elected, but he still got 55% of the vote. I'm sure you've heard of Louis Farrakhan, the leader of the black Muslim sect, the Nation of Islam. He once referred to Judaism as a dirty religion. But, you know, you don't have to look at the fringe of society. You can look right in the middle, and it's for someone like, for example, Patrick Buchanan, who was running for president, as you know, and he was a former aide to the Nixon-Agnew team, and he recently suggested that the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith was out to get him. He claimed that American Jews had tried to drag the United States into our recent war against Iraq because it would serve Israeli interests. I guess he failed to foresee the Scud missiles being aimed at Tel Aviv. Buchanan is the same commentator who previously proclaimed his skepticism about whether hundreds of thousands of Jews actually had been executed in Treblinka's gas chambers. Very much like David Duke, he says the estimate has been severely inflated. And of course, Buchanan is the same commentator who previously argued against the deportation of men convicted of Nazi war crimes. So he does have a history, and it's not an isolated incident. It's no small wonder that even William Buckley, his friend and ideological partner, says that he's anti-Semitic when he says these things. Well, why so much hatred? Why a reappearance of bigotry right now? Well, Philadelphia Magazine, I was in Philadelphia a few months ago, and they did a cover story. They called this An Age of Rage. Cute, but true. There's widespread resentment. And I think it's the basis of this anger is economic. I mean, blacks see a racist behind every decision made in government and business. And whites see blacks as getting special treatment that they don't deserve. And men see their masculine privileges being eroded by the women's movement. And everybody's concerned that Asian Americans might get too many of those merit scholarships, and the same people believe that Jewish Americans have it too good. And it's not hard to figure out why we've become so concerned about making it, because we're not. We've lost 30% of our manufacturing jobs during the last 10 years alone. It's not just a recession. It's not just short term. This is a long-term problem that began decades ago when Daniel Bell called us a post-industrial society. And for many young people, and I might add, especially for young people, the American dream has become a nightmare. They aren't making it, and they don't anticipate improvement, and they want someone to blame. And at the same time, we're seeing unprecedented numbers of newcomers into the United States. If at the present rate, we will surpass the influx of the 1920s. There are huge numbers of newcomers, migrants from Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America who are challenging native-born Americans for jobs. And more of these native-born Americans are feeling personally threatened by this influx. And finally, there's a new activism, a new activist spirit in this country. For better or worse, more and more Americans are translating their attitudes into action. More and more Americans refuse to sit by. They are sick and tired. They are fed up with crime, with corruption in high places, with a bad economy, and they're going to do something about it now. That's the attitude. Even if what they do happens to be the wrong thing. I think the popularity of, what's his name? You knew it, right? A good example of what I'm talking about. I think largely his popularity is a result of this activist impulse that I see as widespread in the country. And the same impulse can be seen in our reverence for Bernard Goetz. Do you remember the so-called subway vigilante? He took charge. He did something. He was fed up. He was sick and tired. He didn't take it anymore. And Oliver North, he's a hero to a lot of people for the same reason. And what about all those people who see Rambo and Rocky films? The same idea. And so on. But the same activist impulse may also explain why there are now more than 4,000 racist skinheads in our major cities. And why more and more anti-Semitic and racist graffiti is being spray painted on buildings around the country. And why hate crimes are on the rise everywhere. And let me, before I continue, explain what I mean by hate crime. Because the term hate crime is relatively new. We didn't have to think about it too much 10 years ago. Hate crimes are directed against people because they are different, because they are Jewish, because they are black, because they are Asian or white or gay or disabled, and so on. And you can see these very, very clearly on college campuses, maybe more clearly than any place else, because the college campus is becoming increasingly more competitive. It costs a lot of money to go. A lot of people don't have the money. And because college campuses are becoming more diverse, they really are more multicultural, just like our society is becoming more multicultural. And we will have to deal with that in the next few years. At Arizona State, fraternity brothers forced Jewish pledges to say, quote, "My number is 6 million. That's how many Jews were killed, and I should have been one of them, sir." At the University of Arizona, the windows of the Jewish students' buildings were shattered by gunfire. At Yale, Ivy League Yale, a Torah was defaced. At the University of Wisconsin, students punched members of a Jewish fraternity and shouted anti-Semitic slurs. There has been a 30% increase in 1 year in anti-Semitic incidents at campuses around the country. And I might add, by the way, there's also a tremendous increase in hate crimes against other groups as well. Asians, blacks, gays, disabled people. It's not just Jews. When people think of hate crimes, they may very well think of racial slurs or anti-Semitic graffiti alone. And those things do happen. But 60% of all hate crimes are assaults. Not property offenses, assaults. Usually brutal assaults that often land the victim in the hospital. They're more like what happened at Brooklyn College a couple of years ago. 3 Jewish students were severely beaten by 15 young men who were shouting anti-Semitic slurs, and they put one of the Jewish students in the hospital where he was treated for severe injuries. The typical perpetrator of a hate crime is not one person at all, but at least 4. This is not a courageous crime, if any crime is courageous. A group of 4 or more teenagers, or young men, those in their early 20s, who go out on a Saturday night the way other young men play a game of cards. They go out to bash for the thrill of it. That's the typical hate crime. They go out to injure with baseball bats, with their boots, with bottles, because it's fun. They're looking for a thrill. Believe it or not, only 5% of all hate crimes are committed by organized groups, the ones that make the headlines. Only 5% by the Ku Klux Klan, by the White Aryan Resistance, by the Aryan Nation, by the Order, by the Silent Brotherhood. Yet, I don't want to minimize the impact of these hate groups because they're more dangerous than their 5% figure would suggest. They often inspire young people who are not members, but who use the propaganda of the group or the symbols of the group as a model. And also, these organized hate groups perpetrate particularly heinous crimes, usually murder, against Jews, blacks, and other minorities. I don't know whether you remember, but in the middle 80s, 1984, talk show host Alan Berg in Denver was shot down, machine gunned down, on the streets of Denver by a group of 5 members of the Silent Brotherhood, or also known as the Order. They made a movie based loosely on that episode. And why did they do it? Well, according to them, he was a loudmouth Jew, and that was enough. Well, finally, what can we do to begin to stem the tide of anti-Semitism and racism in this country? Well, I have 4 things that I want to tell you about, okay? Because I want to leave you on a positive note. Well, as positive as possible. I don't want to be a prophet of doom and gloom. First of all, I believe very strongly that education can play an important role in reducing prejudice and increase sensitivity to the problems of minorities, including Jews. I'm not talking about getting people to like others more or to make any impact on the emotional level of prejudice. But I'm talking about the stereotypes, the beliefs that people have about other groups. We have a new Hate Crime Reporting Act at the federal level. I don't know whether you realize that. For the first time, police departments are taking separate account of hate offenses because they see them as that much more important. And they're reporting these separately to the FBI. That's a start because it increases our awareness, our sensitivity of these horrible acts. They are acts of terrorism. Do you realize that? Because every time a hate crime is perpetrated, it sends a message to every other member of that group. The same thing is going to happen to you. You watch it. That's the message. So it is an act of terrorism in that sense. More and more police departments around the country are being trained to recognize and handle these hate attacks. And for the past 15 years, I've taught a course called The Sociology of Prejudice. in which I try to increase the sensitivity of students to hatred and bigotry. By the way, just as a sad footnote, I just changed the title of my course for the first time. It is now called not the Sociology of Prejudice, but the Sociology of Prejudice and Violence, to reflect what I see as a trend in society that I have to capture, not only in what I say, but in the title of the course. And I try through a panel and through skits to get people together, diverse backgrounds, to discuss these prejudices that they have and make them see that a lot of what they thought were peculiar to one group of people are actually universals. And to try to increase compassion for the plight of someone else's group. Have you ever noticed that people have so much compassion for the problems of their own group? Wouldn't it be nice if they also had a little left over for someone else? And I also try to confront students with their incorrect perceptions. Let me just give you an example. I could go on and on about this, and I don't intend to for your sake. But let me just point that, I ask my students, and it's not just my students, I've asked students all over the country, and it's not just young people, I've asked people in their 30s and 40s, and I've gotten the same answer. What percentage of the population of the United States is Jewish? Do you know what they tell me? You're telling me the truth, huh? Well, the truth is now down to 1.9%, less than 2% of the United States. You ask and I ask you when you get home, try this. Ask people, and you'll get 20 to 30% as an answer. 20 to 30%. Did you know? Listen, what percentage of the population of Germany was Jewish during the 1930s? Do you have any idea? 0.5%. It doesn't. How many pianos could they really redistribute? Not many. Not many. But that's not going to. Those minor details don't stop bigots. And the perception is the perception that Jews have a lot of power and influence. I want to just say this one. Did you know that Irish Americans have almost the same median income as Jews? I've never heard any Irish American being accused of having too much power or of controlling anything but maybe the bars or the police. That's their stereotype. Do you understand what I mean? Do Jews own the media? Well, the head of CBS is not Jewish. The head of NBC is not Jewish. The head of ABC is not Jewish. Head of CNN is not Jewish. But, I had a student, and I was talking like this, and she raised her hand, and she said, the Jews do own the media. I said, how do you know that? She said, because of the Jewish-sounding names in the credits at the end of the programs. I said, really? I said, let me ask you a question. Do blacks control the NBA? Well, 50% of all professional basketball players in the NBA are black. There is a difference between the workers and the owners. But, hey, that's only a minor detail. The second thing we need is to stem the tide is chutzpah. Alan Dershowitz says it very well. We need to be vigilant in our own defense. I think we're very lucky to have the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. They sponsor programs, legal issues. They helped defend. They actually didn't defend. They actually got involved in a case in Portland, Oregon, where an Ethiopian guy was brutally murdered on the street by 3 skinhead youngsters. And what they did was they supplied legal counsel so that the White Aryan Resistance in Fallbrook, California, led by Tom Metzger, you know that name, and his son John, were successfully sued for having inspired this murder, even though they weren't there. Well, Hitler wasn't there either, and Charles Manson wasn't there either. So that's nothing. Inspired this skinhead attack, this murder, and guess what the fine was? $12.5 million. And that was the ADL, in part, in coalition with other groups. Okay. But 3, I don't think chutzpah is enough. We can't do it alone. We're only 2%. We might have enough chutzpah to make us feel like 20%, but we're not. So I argue very much for coalitions, temporary alliances with all groups, not only Jews, all groups of people whose members are victims of bigotry. I think coalitions have certainly worked in the past. At the turn of the century, it was a coalition of white ethnics off the boat from Ireland, Italy, Poland, Russia, who brought us the labor movement. And during the 40s and 50s, there was a very effective coalition of blacks and Jews who fought discrimination. And later, it was women and people of color who united to get affirmative action legislation passed. That, by the way, affirmative action, whether you like it or not, would never have been possible without women. I mean, blacks are only 12% of the population. There's no way that they would have had the power and influence to have the clout to lobby successfully for affirmative action legislation. But you put women and blacks together, and you've got an incredibly powerful, large coalition. I'm sure you've heard about the tensions between blacks and Hasidic Jews in the Crown Heights section of New York. Just briefly, August 19th, 7-year-old black boy was struck and killed by a car driven by a Hasidic motorist. It was an accident. Then there was the fatal stabbing of a Hasidic Jew. I think it was a rabbinical student from Australia, as a matter of fact, and it looked like it was in retaliation. Probably was. And what happened? Reverend Al Sharpton, black leader in New York, led several protest marches through Crown Heights. He's led them through Bensonhurst, through Howard Beach, through Atlantic City, through any place where blacks are victimized. But you see, rather than heal wounds, he opens them wider. Rather than bring Jews and blacks together, he divides them even more. And racists and anti-Semites who read about the racial tensions in New York City, I think, must be having a great laugh at our expense. I mean, they look at Crown Heights and they see what for them may be the ultimate version of comedy. Two minorities, blacks and Jews, two traditional allies, fighting one another in the streets. How funny it must look to see two enemies of the Ku Klux Klan and Nazism, two groups considered by racists to be subhuman, actually at one another's throats. And as bad as he is, and he's bad, Sharpton is filling the streets, and he's also filling a vacuum. A vacuum, a void that is left by whites. I mean, when a black boy is killed, then you know what? Jews should be out there protesting his death. And when a rabbi is murdered, blacks should be on the streets marching in protest. And this is not just wishful thinking. A couple of years ago, two young men painted Nazi and racist graffiti on 20 locations, some buildings and driveways in the Wellesley area. And in response, 800 residents of Wellesley, most of whom were neither Jewish nor black, including a number of important political leaders, rallied to demonstrate their disgust with racism and anti-Semitism. The same thing happened recently at Trinity College, where a guy considered racist, a black Muslim leader, I don't personally know whether he was or not, but it's what I'm talking about is the strategy, was confronted by a coalition of students, including Latino students against racism, young Republicans, young Democrats, and Hillel. And they all got together in a coalition to try to stem the tide of bigotry on that campus, as was represented in their minds by this black Muslim speaker. And the Wellesley incident and the incident at Trinity, and this is my final thing so you can wake up the flavor at this point. Give me one more second. It seems to me that the Wellesley incident and the Trinity incident emphasize my final point. In order to stem the tide of racism and anti-Semitism, we need strong leadership more than anything else. And I'm not talking about leadership within the Jewish community. Not at all. We need leadership at the local, state, and national levels from the non-Jewish community. Most of the leaders in Wellesley were neither black nor Jewish. And it is this kind of leadership that sends the most important message of all to Americans. Namely, that anti-Semitism and racism are not supported here. That intolerance will simply not be tolerated. Thank you very much. we're only 2%, so that is disproportionate to our numbers in the population. At the same time, it's hardly the majority, is it? Depends how you look at it. Anyway, so what?
But that's what I say. It's not a fault. That's
Not
what
at all.
I said. That's not the main question.
It's okay.
What's significantly missing in this whole gestalt, if you will, this whole equation, is the clergy. They're significantly absent. These are the people who are supposed to impart values, sensitivity, understanding, and through your whole talk, not just yours, but I see it all over. Where the hell is the clergy? Quite bluntly.
Well, I'll tell you.
They're absent.
In 1983, the head of the Baptists, I don't want to impugn someone's integrity. I'm sorry now, because it's the Baptist, I do have it, okay. The president of the Southern Baptist Convention, okay, remarked in a radio sermon that Jews got funny-looking noses. That's clergy.
What the clergy is.
Farrakhan is clergy, by the way.
Yes.
I did mention clergy.
No, but I mean...
No, but I mean, I know what you were saying, and you were thinking of some positive direction,
Yes,
and I'm telling you, that not only is there no positive direction, but it's only negative.
Right.
And finally, you are agreeing completely with me, and I thank you for that,
Yes,
because I need
of
some
course.
help here. You know, and I appreciate it. And you know what you're saying, and I agree completely. We need leadership in the non-Jewish community. We need religious and political leadership. How are we going to get that kind of support? We're doing the best we can right now. We are trying our best with lobbying, and the only thing I can say in addition is that you see, coalition. You know, I talked about the need for coalitions. Well, you must be reading about this. In the next couple of decades, we're going to see the number of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males dwindle in number. We are a multicultural society more than we've ever been in our history. And I think this is an opportunity to form coalitions with a lot of different groups so that our leadership is in touch with their leadership. There are areas of common ground, and we ought to exploit those areas of common ground. The common ground, as I see it, is bigotry that affects Jews, blacks, and Latinos, and Asians. We have a lot in common with those Korean grocers in Los Angeles, you know, because the same thing happened to the Jewish shopkeepers in the 1960s. So, you know, what I'm saying is that we can't do it alone. And if we really think we can, I think we're fooling ourselves.
So where is the great support got to be with ADL or APAC or with our own clergy? Where does the general populace have to push?
You mean, where do we push?
Yes.
Well, I think we're pushing right now. I think in all of these directions. But my point is we can't just push ourselves. We've got to push beyond our group, and we've got to recognize these areas of commonality so that we push more generally for an alliance among a lot of different people who have the same problems. And these problems are going to grow in the next few years. That I hate to tell you that, but I'm sure of it. Yes.
I personally believe if we have the philosophy of Gandhi, teach one, we all can work, all of us, each one of us can work. And we see it in the Jewish Community Center here, the number of Christians that are coming here. And like I told Sister Mary at the open pantry when she said Jews working together, I said, we find out that not everybody's an anti-Semite. You find out we don't all have horns. And I think if we work one in one, it's a wonderful thing together with the ADL and all the others. But we can all do a job one-on-one. We don't have to belong to an organization.
Fine.
Would you say a name no longer has anyone's religion?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that, please?
A name no longer tells anyone religion?
A name no longer tells anyone's religion?
This to the young lady that she picked all the...
Well, I see your point, and it's a good point. You know, you can't tell a person's religion by their name. But, I mean, at the same time, there's another point. Even if she's right, my point is that that doesn't mean just because there are a lot of Jews working for a newspaper that they own the newspaper. You see, so that's a good point.
And they're not the wealthiest either.
No. Well, you know, there's David. You probably, I haven't seen David in 30 years, and he said he was going to ask me a hard question.
I'm not going to ask you a
fair,
hard
is it?
question. Growing up, you're a little bit younger than I am, but not much.
Left-handed compliment.
Yeah, I'm using my left hand to express myself.
Right.
It seems that when I was growing up as a kid, there was a tremendous amount of hatred and prejudice. But at the same time, there was a little bit of tolerance with the people that held that prejudice, if that can be. I don't know if it was because of the clergy being active or the values being extolled by the clergy. You know, there was a consciousness among those who hated, if that can be. But today, there has been some kind of a catalyst
That's right.
that has caused this to come out where it has always been, if you know what I'm trying to
Yeah. No, I
say.
think that's a very good point, and I tried to make that as a matter of
Now,
fact.
what do you think is that
A
catalyst?
bad economy. You know, what's
Well, we
happening.
had that.
No, but you know, this is not. This I'm talking now about. We've had fluctuations in the business cycle for a long time, and I'm not talking about this recession at all. And I'm not talking about the recession of 1982. I'm talking about a very long-term trend. I'm talking about people who just don't feel. You know what it is? People see one another now as representing a personal threat to their survival. It's a very sad thing, but it's true that people don't see one another as allies. They see one another as opponents. You know, when the pie is growing, it's large and growing, you know, you're willing to give someone else a piece for dessert, right? But when the pie looks like it's not growing or maybe even shrinking, you're reluctant. You know, it's called a zero-sum definition of the situation. If you get 5 pieces, that's 5 fewer for me, you know, and it's that kind of thinking, this zero-sum thinking. Not only that, but you know, there are more and more challenges. I mean, to some extent, there is a reality here. I mean, the economy, we do have growing multiculturalism. I teach, on a college campus, and you know, it isn't that easy anymore to see white males walking around, and not without a foreign accent. And there are disabled people, and there are foreign students, and more than half the students are women now. I mean, all of these people are challenging. They represent personal threats. So it's a lot more dangerous than it was. I think it's a different kind of prejudice. Yeah, and it's frightening. Yes.
Today sometimes doesn't have a good scope of recollection for what previous years were.
Mm-hmm.
If we return to the year 1932, when Franklin D. Roosevelt became President of the United States, he was faced with enormous problems. And he accepted that challenge, and he did the best he could to try to solve some of the problems. Some of those problems were similar to our today's problems. And a great many problems we have today are much different than those. In your opinion, if he were president now, do you think he would have thought of some good solutions for these problems that we're facing today?
What a question! You know what? I like FDR. He's one of my heroes. I would hope so. But and again, certainly we need strong leadership. But you're right. Conditions are different today. I'm going to say I don't know. I really don't know. It's a hypothetical.
Naturally, your talk today has been beamed towards the problems of prejudice against the Jews, and the Jews are involved. But I feel that in this last 6 weeks or 8 weeks that we've had such problems to look at in the Los Angeles, that the coalition must be made between all of us to understand the problems of the black people in Los Angeles who are rebuilding a life. For example, having read that there is great anger with the black population in Los Angeles because white construction workers are getting the jobs of rebuilding their areas that have been devastated so badly, when this is the time for the black construction workers to have been given an opportunity and to build, to make a few dollars to get along with the problem of living today. And I think that we've lost almost in these last 6 weeks. The last week or two or so we've been diverted into other problems, so that you don't think about it too much. I think the coalition must start and go further than just our own problems.
Oh, definitely. Let me just point out a couple of really scary things. First of all, the black underclass is now 4 times larger than it was in the 60s. 4 times larger. I mean, this is This is not the first riot or revolt that we've seen in the 80s or 90s. It's a continuing thing. In Miami, there have been a large number of riots. Problems between Cubans and blacks. Washington, between blacks and Latinos, and riots. New York, a couple of riots. There have been some in New Jersey. Detroit. This is not an isolated incident. It's not the first, and it's definitely not the last. It's really frightening if you consider just numbers alone. Some people say to me, I get letters, and I should have written it for them, but thank you. I'm going to go get it. But and what's happening is the jobs that used to be in the city are all moving to the suburbs, and there's just more hopelessness and despair. Bob?
Jack, I know it's implied in your remarks, but I think we ought to talk about strong, humane leadership, because I am afraid a strong leader is not going to be very humane. And I have reference to Mr. Verona.
Yes.
You say we're a multicultural society, but isn't that just the problem? Look what's happening in Yugoslavia and in Czechoslovakia. Every ethnic group wants to be independent now, and one's striving against the other. And this is a reflection of that feeling, that one is better than the other. What is the solution for that?
Oh, hey, listen, I have problems enough trying to Listen, we're very lucky that we're not yet Eastern Europe, I mean, what has happened is that there's no structure. There's no structure in Eastern Europe.
But there's a terrible growth of anti-Semitism.
Oh, there is. There's anti-Semitism.
There are hardly any Jews there.
That's never stopped. It's funny. I had a student, and he said, he was from Maine. And he said, gee, I'm not prejudiced. I've never seen anybody black. One thing we know in sociology is that you don't have to have contact with people of a different group to hate them. You just have to have contact with the prejudice. And so you can get that from watching television. It's not, or going to school or listening to someone tell a racial joke. It doesn't take much. And Jews have always been the universal scapegoat. They're sensational. They're wonderful as scapegoats. You stop to think they're always seen as both the biggest communists and the biggest capitalists all at once. The same people.
What about purposes?
Yes.
Unfortunate. By the way, Arthur Schlesinger wrote a significant book, Disuniting of America. So you might...
Yeah, how sad.
Yeah.
Yes,
this Tuesday night, right at the center, they have a movie with our rabbi, Shapiro, is going to be in with the prejudice in the city of Springfield. But the Black-Jewish dialogue, which I'm a member of, do get into a lot of the issues, but very few people know about the issue that we try to, we have the clergy involved in it, and this is something, and the Federation has funded school teachers to reduce racism in our schools.
That's wonderful. And by the way, you have a tough job ahead of you. And behind you, I'm sure.
For the past several weeks, every talk show is featuring all kinds of hate.
That's true.
Yes.
Every talk show.
Yeah. The Metzgers are back on television.
They're featuring the eternal Jews.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
What is the negative and positive outcome?
What a dilemma. What a dilemma. I mean, on the one hand, people ought to know about these groups. On the other hand, you wonder, as I'm sure you do, which is implicit in your question, whether these shows only teach people to hate. And I think, undoubtedly, both of these are true. I mean, I don't know what to do about it. I'm against censorship. I think if we feel very much threatened by this, that we should boycott these shows. But I'm not really sure that we ought to. I think people ought to know how slimy these organized hate groups really are. And sometimes they, not always, you see, this is the problem. Sometimes they actually are their worst enemy in terms of public relations, because they look like what they are. The problem is that they're getting those facelifts and wearing those toupees now, like David Duke, and they look more like Patrick Buchanan than ever, and they're not wearing their sheets anymore, and they're wearing, suits and ties like the Metzgers do. And so now they don't even quack like a duck. You don't know it's a duck. All I'm doing is restating your question. I really don't know what the answer is. I mean, on the one hand, I think people have to. I don't like people to be deprived of information, and this is information. On the other hand, let's hope that the people who produce these shows exercise some social responsibility and don't do it just for sensationalism, which unfortunately some of them do. And you know that, and I know. Very much for your excellent question.